There's something about the mind that works against itself. It loops. It pulls you backward into things that already happened or forward into things that haven't. And somewhere in all that movement, the actual moment you're living in just slips by. Most people know this feeling. You're sitting somewhere, maybe it's quiet, maybe it's not, and your mind is somewhere else entirely, running through a conversation that ended hours ago, sketching out scenarios for tomorrow that may never happen. The body is here. The mind is somewhere in 2019 or next Thursday. Buddhism has been sitting with this problem for a long time. Not with answers exactly, more like observations, careful ones. The kind that come from people who spent years just watching the mind, watching how it moves, watching what it clings to. Here are 6 of those observations. 1. The past already happened. The future isn't here yet. Sounds obvious when you say it out loud. But most of us spend a surprising amount of time in one of those 2 places, replaying something, rehearsing something, somewhere other than here. And the strange thing is, we don't always notice we've left. There's an old teaching, concentrate the mind on the present moment, not because the past doesn't matter or the future isn't real, but because right now is the only place anything is actually happening. The past is memory. The future is imagination. Only this moment is alive in any real sense. Think about what that means for overthinking. Most of what the mind churns on isn't even real in the present tense. It's either a recording or a projection. We're suffering over something that isn't here, and meanwhile, here is passing by unnoticed. There's a story about a monk and his student crossing a river. The monk just crossed it. Steady, calm, one step at a time. The student stood at the edge, thinking about the current, thinking about falling, thinking about everything that could go wrong, running through it, calculating. The monk looked back and said something like, "You can't cross a river you're still standing in front of." The river was crossable. The crossing just required being present for it. That's the whole thing, really. The mind moves. The moment stays still. And a lot of suffering lives in that gap between where we are and where our attention has wandered off to. 2. Thoughts come and go, they don't have to stick. The image Buddhism keeps returning to is weather, clouds moving across a sky, some light, some heavy, some that block the sun entirely. But the sky doesn't become the cloud. It just holds it for a while, and then the cloud moves on. We tend to do the opposite. A thought shows up and we treat it like a verdict. Like it's telling us something true and permanent about ourselves, about the situation, about what's coming. We grab it, we turn it over. We follow it down into other thoughts, and then other thoughts after that, until we've completely lost the thread of where we started. The teaching here isn't that thoughts are bad or that you should stop having them. That's not really possible anyway. The teaching is simpler. You don't have to attach. You can notice a thought without becoming it. There's another image that shows up sitting by a river, watching leaves float past. You notice them. You don't grab each one. You don't hold it under the water. You just let them move downstream. Thoughts are like that. They arrive. They drift. The suffering isn't the thought itself, it's the grip. It's the moment you stop observing the thought and start living inside it. Loosen that grip, even slightly, and the noise starts to quiet on its own. We become what we think. That's the edge of this teaching that cuts deepest. The mind shapes experience more than we usually give it credit for, which means the thoughts we choose to hold and the ones we choose to release, that choice matters, even if it's quiet, even if it happens without fanfare. 3. Trying to control everything is exhausting, and it doesn't really work. There's a version of overthinking that's really just an extended argument with reality. Something is happening, something difficult, something uncertain, something that didn't go the way you wanted, and the mind keeps insisting it should be happening differently. So it keeps turning it over, trying to find the angle where it makes sense, where it resolves, where control becomes possible. And that process feels productive. It feels like doing something. but mostly it's just friction. The teaching here is simple and a little uncomfortable. Suffering comes less from what's happening and more from how we're relating to it. The event and the suffering aren't the same thing. There's a space in between, and in that space is where the real work happens or doesn't. What tends to fill that space is the need to control, to fix, to predict, to manage every possible outcome before it arrives. And for some situations, that's useful. But a lot of what we try to control isn't actually in our hands. The way other people behave, the way things unfold, whether something we're afraid of will happen. Thich Nhat Hanh used to tell a story about a man pushing a boulder that wouldn't move, just grinding against it day after day, wearing himself down to nothing, complaining, straining, getting nowhere. And someone came along and simply asked, "Why are you still pushing?" The man didn't have a good answer. Sometimes the most useful thing isn't more effort. It's not better strategy or more careful analysis. It's just stopping, recognizing what's yours to move and what isn't, and letting the rest be what it is. There's a release in that when you actually find it, not defeat, release. The difference is that one feels like giving up and the other feels like setting something down that you were never meant to carry in the first place. 4. The breath is always there. Mindfulness gets talked about a lot now, in ways that can make it sound complicated or precious or like something you have to schedule and optimize. But at its core, it's pretty plain. Pay attention to what's here. Don't drift. And when you drift, which you will, come back. The breath is a useful anchor because it's always happening. You don't have to create it or search for it or remember to bring it. It's already there every moment, whether you're paying attention to it or not. In, pause, out. When the mind is calm, the breath is calm. That's the teaching. But it runs the other direction too. Slow the breath down, make it deliberate, and something in the mind follows. Not instantly, not perfectly, but the connection is real. There's something physiological happening. The nervous system responds. The loop of anxious thinking gets interrupted, even briefly. And briefly is enough to start. Mindfulness isn't about achieving some permanent state of peace. It's more like a practice of returning. The mind wanders, that's what minds do, and you notice, and you come back. That act of noticing and returning, done again and again, builds something, trains something. The gaps between the runaway thoughts get a little wider. The grip loosens a little more easily. It doesn't require a cushion or a retreat or a particular posture. Just attention and some patience, and doing it again when you forget, which will be often. That's fine. Forgetting and returning is the practice, not a failure of it. The mind is everything. What you think you become. That's a teaching that can feel abstract until you sit quietly for 10 minutes and watch what your mind does on its own. Then it starts to feel very specific. 5. Most of what we worry about doesn't need to be as complicated as we make it. Life has a tendency to accumulate. Concerns, obligations, comparisons, expectations, your own and other people's. And the mind adds its own layer on top of all of that. The analysis, the second guessing, the narration running in the background that won't quite turn off. We think our way into complexity and then wonder why everything feels so heavy. There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. That's how one old text puts it, not a destination. Not something you arrive at after you've handled everything, resolved everything, figured everything out. Something available now, in ordinary moments, if you're not too busy thinking past them. The hard part is that ordinary moments don't feel like enough. They feel like placeholder time, the waiting room before the real thing happens, so we don't settle into them. We keep scanning ahead. But that scanning is the problem, not the solution. There's a concept the Zen tradition works with called shibumi. It resists easy translation, but it points towards something like the elegance of simplicity, the beauty in what's plain and unadorned. One master described it this way: the simpler the life, the deeper the meaning. less noise, more of what's actually there. That doesn't mean doing less or caring less. It means not adding unnecessary weight, not manufacturing problems that don't exist yet, not making the ordinary moment smaller by insisting it should be something other than what it is. When you simplify, not dramatically, just gradually, just by releasing some of the mental clutter, something underneath becomes a little more visible. A kind of quiet that was always there, just crowded out. 6. Nothing stays the same. Not the good parts, not the hard parts. Impermanence is maybe the most repeated idea in Buddhism. And it's repeated so often because the mind resists it so consistently. We want things to stay. Good things we want to hold on to. Bad things we're afraid will last forever, but nothing does. Everything is moving. The feeling, the circumstance, the version of you sitting here right now, all of it is in motion, even when it doesn't seem like it. All conditioned things are impermanent. That's the direct teaching. Strive on with diligence. Not strive on because it'll fix everything or because effort guarantees a good outcome. Just strive on, keep going. Because nothing, including this difficulty, is the final word. Overthinking often treats problems like they're permanent, like the anxiety you're feeling right now is just how things are. Like the situation that's weighing on you has always been this way and will continue to be. But that's never actually been true, not once, in the entire history of you. Things have always shifted. Situations have changed. The feeling that was unbearable eventually became manageable and then became something you barely remember. That's not inspiration. That's just how time works. The fear that locks overthinking in place is often the fear of being stuck. If I don't figure this out right now, I'll be stuck with it. If I don't control this outcome, I'll be trapped in a bad one. But the thing about impermanence is stuck isn't a permanent state either. Nothing is. The worry you're carrying right now has an expiration date. You don't know when. It might be tomorrow, it might be a year from now, but it will shift. Something will change inside you, around you, in the situation itself. Because that is the only thing that has ever consistently happened. Everything changes. The mind settles a little when it really absorbs that, not because life becomes easier or problems disappear, but because the urgency loosens. The desperate need to resolve everything right now softens slightly. There's time, there's movement, nothing is sealed. 6 teachings. 6 ways of looking at a mind that won't stop running. None of them are instructions exactly, more like angles. Ways of seeing what's already happening, the thoughts, the grip, the breath, the moment, just slightly differently than before. The mind is always doing something. That part doesn't change. What can shift is how much space you give it.